Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lorandom podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bauman, the editor-in-chief at Lorandom, and today we continue our Friday podcast episodes as a companion to our Monday editorials. And today's episode is with terra0, an art collective exploring the creation of hybrid ecosystems in a technosphere, who recently released their long-awaited project, Autonomous Forest, that was nearly 10 years in the making, which came out earlier this week on Monday. And then our editorial, which also came out on Monday, was our Standout Art of 2025 article. It was a first for us to ask community members that we really respected to look back at 2025 and give us their favorite art of the year. So we asked 12 trusted artists, curators, and collectors what art mattered most to them in 2025. And that includes people like Sasha Stiles and Christiane Paul and Raoul Pal. It's a really good overview of the art that mattered to some really interesting people. So definitely check that out. And then I'm really excited about today's conversation, though, with terra0. They are this incredibly fascinating art collective that released a white paper as university students in 2016, which outlined the concept of how a forest might be able to own itself with blockchain technology. Basically, the idea was there back in 2016, but the technology wasn't. And so this project, which is a mix of art and technology and ecology and economics and philosophy, it took them nearly 9 years to actually realize. And it's exactly the kind of work that's interesting to me right now. It's complex, it's protocolic, it's living, it's generative. And we have this really interesting conversation with the artist, and I can't wait to share it. So let's begin. Yeah, I guess maybe we can just begin. And the first question is just about how you two first met and started the project. I guess there was originally another person as well, right? I think it was in 2015. So were you in university at the time, or how did the project, I guess, begin about 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a very long time since we're working on this. And also it's a little bit confusing for us to tell like this story because it has had so many different phases. Originally, we developed this project as part of a university project. We were both studying at the Berlin University of the Arts with Joachim Sauter in the new media class. And this began as like one semester project. But right after we kind of realized, okay, there's something interesting in there and maybe it's worth to spend more time on this. And also our professor back then realized this. And when I can remember correctly, he gave us like one semester off to kind of like continue to work on this. Around that time, we also met Max Hampshire, who wasn't studying at our university, but who joined us in the very early stages of terra0. Back then, we kind of were like this core team of us three, but then also we were always collaborating with other people from the university or outside. And so basically we kind of formed terra0 as a little bit like a collective maybe, but we never really formalized what it actually is. But it was more like this umbrella under which we worked on like different projects with like fluctuating people involved. And then after a while, or like after a couple of years, actually, it kind of crystallized that it's basically us three mainly. And then at one point, I can't remember when, but then Max went off for other projects and like had to shift a little bit his focus. And then it kind of evolved in such a way that it became us as an artist duo. But that's also like the confusing thing because we basically named everything terra0, like the artwork, us as a group, like the concept paper. So there's always like a little bit of confusion around it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can just add a little bit more about history in terms of how it developed then. So when we first in 2016 published the white paper, which is this sort of almost provocative, like speculative white paper, which is about this autonomous forest or this kind of forest which is controlled by an agent or by a computer program. And this paper was mainly at this point when we published it, a sort of almost speculative exercise. I mean, we looked a little bit into the technology which we describe in this paper, and this technology existed to certain points at this time, but it was like not in the right state to actually use it in real life. So at this point, like DAOs were basically barely developed. I mean, I think the DAO hack was actually even after we published the paper, but I'm not quite sure. But like at this point, like the technology was really, really nascent. Also, AI was not as big as it was now. So a lot of these core technologies we described were just like not developed. So we called this somewhere also, what did we say, a near future scenario in a sense, that it's something which we think could have happened and we could build this, but it's not something which was fully developed in terms of technological requirements at the point where we wrote the paper. We quickly realized this, and we also realized that we don't have the capital to actually implement this project by ourselves, because we were at this point art students and didn't have the money to just buy a piece of land in a size where this makes sense. So we took the white paper and split it up in multiple sort of like chunks of ideas, you could say. So really like specific concepts which were described in the white paper, which we then isolated and almost strategically build these test cases in which we're trying to get these ideas into art installations which could be shown in an institutional context, because this was the time where slowly art institutions were waking up to blockchain, but this was even before the NFT boom. So this was essentially a time where blockchain seemed to be having a really utopian potential, where art institutions were interested in critical engagement with blockchain technology, something which a little bit slowed down after the after the sort of NFT hype of 2021, 2022.
Maybe because I think there's something I always like kind of forget about like this development phase, but there was quite a long phase where we developed this as part of like this art school, art discourse thing. But then there was like this time where we really sensed like, okay, this is worth realizing it, like this is worth like implementing it on a one-to-one scale. And we were like really looking in all different directions to enable this. So we had a lot of talks with actually like venture capital people came to us. We thought of like doing this as a startup. We had actually like worked a couple of years together in like state-funded research projects, which were really disappointing in the results. But like this was like an approach from us, like, because we were kind of really looking like, okay, how can we realize this? There's something interesting on the table. We don't have the money to do this. We also don't have like the recognition as artists to go to an institution back then. I think it's really interesting because I went like the other day through our like archive, and there's just like this year or 1.5 years where we were on like startup fairs, when we talked to like really different actors and like looked 360 around to possibilities. And I think none of it really made sense, like partly because we didn't want to make it a product. You know, like we kind of wanted to do it as research, but then like state-funded research is also like really constrained in what it can produce. We kind of ended up in the arts because there was, as Paul said, there was suddenly like an interest from like institutions in like discussing this, and we realized, okay, there's actually quite a nice space to put these ideas out. There's like a way of like actually like producing these test cases and then like having also like a feedback. But I think like in retrospect, it kind of like it does make sense that it's like that we ended up like so adjacent to the art world. But I think like it was actually like not a linear direction or like path we followed.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense that it wasn't I guess the art direction would have pushed it in a non-capitalist direction too, which I think aligns with the project. And yeah, so you talked about how it wasn't ready to be developed at the time of the white paper because the technology, or wasn't ready to be realized at the time of the white paper. So it was more of a near future project. Is 11 years or 10 years, is that about sort of, I guess it's more like 9 years, 9 or 10 years. Yeah, I wonder if that's about what you expected, and and then can you just talk about that arc? So from 2016, so because it includes other projects too, right? Like Premna Daemon and Flowertokens, and so there were these other steps along the way. And I just wonder, did you expect it to take almost 10 years? And then can you just talk about how those other projects shaped the direction of what ultimately became autonomous forest?
Yeah, I think like from like this arc, it's also interesting to understand that the first project was Flowertokens, and it was in 2018. It wasn't at an art institution; it was a trust in Berlin, which is like this co-working space, but also like a discourse space. The reason why we did it was because we had a talk in Amsterdam at a startup fair. And there was a guy who just like handed us or like wire transferred us 3,000 euros because he was asking, how can he invest in us? And we said like, you can't invest in us. And he was like, yeah, but I like the project. Like, can I give you like some money? Like no strings attached. We don't even have like the contact details of this person. And so we had like 3,000 euros. And then we like used this to build this installation at Trust, which was Flowertokens, which we then also, I mean, like, it was like a wall of 100 flowers, and then like we tokenized these flowers and created like a little like a market around it, and we sold them, of course, for 30 euros, like hundreds of like 3,000 euros, like which were like the production budget. And then actually we did other projects. We had like our first institutional show or like a group show in like an institution at Schinke Pavilion, where we met Simon Denny, who curated the show. It's called Proof of Work. And then it kind of slowed down again. I mean, like we had like talks, group shows, all that stuff. But really, I think it picked up again like in during the NFT hype, because I think institutions were really looking for like projects which had more depth in it and kind of had to feel like, okay, we need to touch on this topic, but then it's kind of really noisy and it's hard to find something interesting in there. And then on the other side, actually, we got like some unexpected retroactive funding, because suddenly this Flower Token project, which really, like it was mostly friends of us or like really close people from like following the project who like bought like a token for like 30 euros. And nothing really happened to it. And then like they got like discovered, and we actually like funded a lot of our practice afterwards, like from like having like a sudden inburst of like these trading fees and royalties we got from this project. And actually like even like other projects in Berlin who had like Flower Tokens were able to kind of like sell them at quite a good price and then like fund their practice a while for it. Yeah.
Can I interrupt and just add like a little bit of context to Flowertokens and Premna Daemon? Yeah. I also want to mention for the 10 years question, it's really funny. There is a Reddit thread on like Ethereum, on the Ethereum Reddit, where someone mentions, or it's like the first comment under terra0, under the first original terra0 white paper was posted there, is, oh, this is a great idea, probably really early, in 10 years this will make sense. And this is really like 10 years ago. So Reddit was sort of right about everything again, like it is. Maybe just 2 points to Flowertokens and Premna Daemon, just to even contextualize them more in the context of the project. So Flowertokens is essentially on how to tokenize something living, right? And this was a question which was already presented in the white paper, as we talked there about the similarities between ERC20 tokens and sort of wood tokens, we called them, which is something of a tokenization of actual wood. And for Flowertokens, we took this specific part and we're looking at how do we tokenize something living and what does it actually mean to tokenize something living? Because as an act, this seemed to be like really weird and also kind of brutal, right? You're like, okay, this is now a plant. You are now a tradable asset on the blockchain. What does happen with it? For us, it was quite interesting that the market relations were not the most predominant relations in this experiment, which meant that people were not trading these things as much as we like imagined they would trade them, but rather they would build like relations to these things. So they were more looking at them as Tamagotchis rather than as sort of tradable assets. And because they were also changing their state all the time, right? They were like, we were essentially broadcasting live how they were growing. People developed really emotional relations to these things, which sort of didn't fit really well in the targeted like market relations. So they didn't become that much of a speculative asset while they were growing, but they were only becoming the actual speculative asset after the whole experiment was done already, which for us was a quite interesting realization in terms that the tokenization is maybe not always happening in these market relations, but rather that it can mean other things for people, which are like not easily grabbed by value or by what we defined as like, I would say, capitalistic value. So, and I think this is something which then also developed a little bit further into autonomous forests. So I think in autonomous forests you can see this ideas being sort of revoked again, that there is this basically relation there is this thing which has a relation to the market, but it is not completely inherent in the market, or it's not about just being a tradable asset, essentially. And the second is the Premna Daemon, and I will make this a little bit shorter. The Premna Daemon was essentially a way how to formalize the relation between a non-human or kind of this cybernetic entity and an institution, so the outside. We were there the first time essentially working with law, because we set up contracts with institutions. We set up a mixture out of a smart contract construct and basically a law construct, so basically paper law, and we formalized this relation. And I think this was the first time for us working with this mixture of both of these things to formalize relationships. And I think it's pretty easy to see how this is also transported into autonomous forest. As like in autonomous forest, a lot of stuff is formalized through actual legal requirements and also through smart contracts. Yeah, just to sort of give you an overview how these projects actually were early experiments and then sort of feed it into the bigger projects we're doing now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you're building relationships with these, I guess, non-traditional entities through blockchain and using blockchain not as a market mechanism, but you're using the non-market logic of blockchain, which I guess that emphasizes more the ownership of something non-fungible, I guess. So I guess to understand that shift from the white paper and then after Flowertokens and Premna Daemon, it seems like a pivot, like something like from nature as an economic agent to the emphasis then seemed to go more towards taking nature outside the economic sphere. Is that sort of what the shift was over these last, I guess, 9 years or so?
Yeah, I don't think even that I think it was already in the first white paper, actually. I remember we having our first like bigger public like panel discussion. It was at Transmediale in 2017, and we presented this project. And we realized, okay, like the whole crowd is like completely divided. You know, like the half of it like hated it and was like, okay, this is so cruel, this like hyper capitalistic, and like what are you doing to nature? And the other side was like really enthusiastic and was like, oh, this is a way to protect nature. And so like I think like it was really interesting that we kind of presented this like a structure or like a framework, and depending on like how you like set a certain parameters, it could go either way. And we also realized this because we had like really weird approaches from like venture capitalists, people like trying to set this up to circumvent, I don't know, like nature preservation regulations or so, but then also like people who are like, okay, there's really good means to create these nature preservation zones. In the beginning, we kind of like played with this ambiguity because we thought it's interesting to really understand the full spectrum of possibilities, what like this technology can enable or can't. And then working on this for like years and years, you of course get like more stronger opinions on certain matters. I think it was also like kind of a deep learning curve in like concepts of nature preservation and different ecological methodologies, which you can't really unlearn at one point, just like by being confronted by it so much. And then there's of course like also like the political landscape changes where you, I don't know, like question like how much like an ambiguity can serve a purpose, or maybe it's good to take a proper stance. And then most importantly, I think it is kind of easy to come up with like these really abstract like ideas until they stay like abstract ideas, right? And now we're getting like to how like autonomous forest came about, because 4 years ago a private art institution, the LAS Art Foundation, approached us, who actually knew already the project and said like, it's a great project, let's team up and really implement this on a one-to-one scale with like a real forest. Let's do it right ahead. And we actually like pushed back a little bit and said like, okay, now we have the chance. We actually don't know if we can really just do it, because it's a different level of seriosity if like you actually can do something. There's like real world implication for like a real ecosystem, for example, attached, but then also we said like, okay, we can't just realize something we have drawn up like 6.5 years ago, and kind of like everything changed, like our position changed, the technical environment changed, the political environment changed. So we actually said like we want to do this, but we actually need some more time, and like doing this now does mean like completely rewriting the whole project and like updating it to like our current times.
Again, it's really interesting how the blockchain is utilized and tied into the project. And yeah, we talked about how it helps to build this relationship between the audience or the owner and this entity, this natural entity that would otherwise, I guess, have a different ownership mechanism. And I wonder too, just why blockchains are so critical, besides maybe building that relationship between, something non-fungible and the owner of that token. I wonder, like, what other purpose is the blockchain serving? So there's things like record keeping and legitimacy in governments and accountability. And I guess, would this project be able to exist, or would it break if the blockchain wasn't there?
To a certain degree, no, I think, but it would make a lot of actual processes quite more difficult to do in the way we want them to do. So if you think of voting, for example, like token voting, there is really no good way of doing this in a proper decentralized way in which you can guarantee that there is no, or in which basically there is no trust needed, right? Imagine maybe to make this more concrete, we are both on the board. There are like 6 people on the board, but we also have control mostly to the servers which run the infrastructure of autonomous forest. If you would now say, okay, we do a voting, which is, don't use blockchain technology, just use the servers, you go to like a website and you vote there. Like, we control literally like the infrastructure of the servers. So, but we're also in the board. That seemed to me like a kind of huge conflict of interest in a sense. This is like, oh yeah. And specifically if there's no way of proving like how people voted. So like just in terms of technology, it becomes this problem in which, yeah, you have to essentially trust us, but we're running the servers and we're in the board. So yeah, just to make a really feasible example on how this is actually makes stuff easier, I would say.
Yeah, and maybe to add to this, I think the first white paper, of course, like couldn't like be conceived without blockchain, but also I think because it was back then, like there were like a lot of like legal gray areas, and like everything was like really like not really defined, and so you could just like make claims like, oh, this is like how it could be interpreted. These days, like all these things, and especially like not all of these things, but like everything we do in our project is well within the German jurisdiction. So this was also like something really important for us. And because everything is within the German jurisdiction, there would also be a way to do this without blockchain. But I think nowadays, especially with a project like this, the hardest part is like actually like having people engage over like a longer period of time, because like everybody's like, like it's like so hard to like find time, like find energy like for anything. And like the idea like to organize like a large group of people, which is not locally but like translocally, has like a local part, but also like maybe like a global interest in like people sharing this, not like bound by the nationality or like geographic location. And I think this to allow for this without blockchain, with like this identity level of like allowing safe voting, it is quite difficult. And I think another aspect is also that we spent way too much money on like legal research to implement only like this project, but we truly think that like what we did here can also be like reused and adapted for like different use cases, or like maybe different instances of like a project like this. And like this repeatability, or like being able, like is something which works much better with the blockchain part than like the bureaucratic side, where you can't get around having dozens of meetings with some bureaucracy clerks, etc.
So you kind of see it as an experiment in public policy and blockchains. I also wonder, we talked earlier a lot about all the changes that have taken place over the last 9 or 10 years since the white paper. And another one of those that also started around 2015 was another big change that's impacting us today is like deep learning and AI. And I wonder how that has impacted the project. I mean, is that part of the workflow at all? Or can you talk about how, or whether at all AI has really impacted the project?
Well, I think it would have been like quite interesting if like AI at this level would have been around for like the first iteration of it. But I think because mainly due to like aspects of agency of natural ecosystem, and the question like who can speak for them, who can decide for them, like can we find like do we know what a forest wants, like these questions, which also lead like often into like a weird, like from our perspective, maybe like wrong anthropomorphization of like something where you don't really have like a singular subject where you can like say like, okay, this is like its interest, etc. So we kind of like approach this from like really shifting, okay, there can only be like a human perspective deciding on like, like what is good for an ecosystem out of like a human perspective, just like from the time perspective, because otherwise, like who would say that like maybe like everything you do is like right for the ecosystem, but it takes like 200 years for it to develop, We kind of have like in the autonomous forest quite a heavy focus on autonomy as an absence of economic exploitation, and like a sturdy ecosystem, as in there's not much flux of like a lot of plants, for example, die off or something like this. But other than that, it's like really, this is like what we say, like what we define as like what the forest wants and nothing else. And I think with AI, it's always like it's easily like an obfuscation that you feel like, okay, there's like an external interest subject, who wants something, but it's basically at one point like baked into it, like by a human. And I think in the first project we kind of like also like, I mean, we said like, okay, this hybrid autonomy entity acts on its own, but of course, like it acts according to like rules we wrote into the code previously. The autonomous forest is not really affected by like this AI development, but I don't know, Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe to zoom a little bit out, I think there is in general the question of legal fictions and what do legal fictions allow on basically the level of functionality. There is a Chaos Computer Club talk from Charles Stross, which is like a science fiction writer, who describes essentially corporations as slow AIs. This talk is like from 2015 or something. And I think there is some like really interesting truth to this, in a sense that these are all modes of organizations which allow for a certain production, which is still targeted to something. Like all of these organizational forms, like they have like subject in them, and these subjects do like still certain sort of specific decisions about things. And I do think using an AI to manage the forest is not that different actually from using a DAO to manage a forest. It's just that one thing has essentially like transparent rules, which can be discussed all the time, while the other one has like encoded rules, which are harder to discuss and obfuscated in certain deep levels of essentially neural nets. So for me, it's more a question of intentionality and the question what legal fictions actually can do, and if they are helpful or not. And if we look for example, the questions if ecosystems should become persons, this is like something which is discussed a lot, and also the question of non-human personhood in a sense of animal rights. It's always for me a functional question, what does these legal fictions actually empower? And where do these legal fictions actually help? And where do they sometimes also just obfuscate things? And I do think this is like really critical to see on like a global level, because they also depend on like frameworks of ontology of the people who are living through these legal fictions. And this means that having personhood for river in New Zealand, where like the indigenous people like decide for this, river is way more aligned with their ontology, with their lived ontology, than, for example, if we in Germany just decide, oh, this forest is a person, because we're like not having the same sort of like ontology. We're like people of the Enlightenment and I don't say this in like a negative or positive sense. I say this in a historical sense, right? And so I do think there is a way different question of how is personhood defined, and I think this is also what the project trying to tease out, I think now a little bit, is how does it functionally different from being a legal entity and sort of being this more sort of group of people who decide these things. And yeah, it's really like an experiment. But from my personal opinion, like a lot of these legal fictions are essentially can be boiled down to decision making of groups.
Yeah, so it seems like the way that AI has impacted the practice is more on or has impacted the project is more on a conceptual level, that it wasn't so much the technologies, but more about maybe some of the post-human ideas that the technologies have raised about non-human rights and non-human interests, and how that can extend to other intelligences, including AI, but also natural other intelligences as well. Do you know Holly Herndon and Matt in Berlin? And I guess, are you familiar with their ideas on protocol arts? Because it seems like this project would be a classic example of a protocol, or what they call protocol art. And one thing that I've been thinking about recently is how protocols are becoming more and more complex, and how they're starting to merge with what some artists are doing with worlds. And so I'm starting to also think of maybe the next level of complexity for protocols, maybe above just like using smart contracts, is like cybernetic protocol stacks, basically like projects that are several different layers of protocols all, cybernetically working together. And that is sort of how I'm also thinking about artists creating worlds with these technologies like blockchains and AI and I just wonder how you see yourself as either creating protocols, or does that make sense also that this like once they become maybe complex enough that they become maybe something different?
Yeah, I can start to answer this, but also really probably not, probably I can't speak to all of the things you just said, but maybe let's start with, yes, we know Holly and Matt, they like the project, I think, which is really cool. I think they follow it quite for some time now, and they also support it when they can. So big shout out and big thanks to them. We know also the term protocol art. It's quite interesting. I've never digged into who was actually the first person who said it. I think it comes from Matt, but I'm also like not 100% sure. Seen it a lot first around more blockchain-based work, basically the whole crowd which is interested in smart contracts and what smart contracts formally can do, how these things can be appropriated to make rule-based experiments, essentially, rule-based experiments with value. This is already probably 2 years ago, or maybe even longer, when I first heard this term. I do think it's a really interesting term to describe essentially something which was, or for me, is a continuation of a lot of other art forms. So, for example, there is something like system aesthetics, which is from like the 70s. I always forgot who, what's the name of the person?
Jack Burton.
Yes, exactly. This is the, which I find really interesting. So this is the first time in art people looked more into how systems work and how we can abstract artistic work from a specific object, but rather think of them in a, as you said, like cybernetic way. There was a lot of critique of this to a certain degree. I think if you look at the artists, how they like proposed these things and what they actually did, they kind of sort of failed. I think they kind of like stayed also in the limits of sort of the institutions, the white cubes and so on, which I do think makes sense also for the time. And I do think there is some part of protocol art, and I mean, we're talking now about something which is not defined yet. So I think no one has written like an extensive article about what protocol art is actually. I think there will be at one point, but it's pretty undefined. But for me, it takes like this direction from system aesthetics. It takes also some direction from relational aesthetics. So from the question of how things are relating in specific social contexts to each other, and how like specific forms of social context can be rebuilt and can be redesigned. And I think this is also something which in protocol art interests us. And I think the third thing I would say is like that it is related to software art in some sort of way, that specifically we see in early software art, like before it becomes the purely let's say visual art form. We have a lot of examples of like software or media art which is about interaction, which is about protocols, and you can make like really easily the case there is a history of like protocols already used in software art. For example, like all the telegardens, the first examples of people controlling like a robot arm to essentially make a garden or like water a garden. These are for me always like examples of protocol art. So I think it's more something which like merges together from like different forms or different strains of historic references in a sense, or historic notions. The second point is, yes, I do think we work with protocols a lot, and we try to merge them in different stacks, as you said. So we're not trying necessarily to just use smart contracts, but we think of, okay, how do they interact with the law? How can they interact with the law, which is itself like a whole stack. And I would say, specifically with this project, specifically with Autonomous Forest, we really were specific on the law. So we really tried to like nail down the law, which also is why this project took so long. This is really like for me, like the most important part. But we also engage, obviously, with a lot of places which artists normally don't engage, like the registry of the land, all of these kind of things. And there is this like net art diagram, which is probably a lot of people know, which is kind of like the art happen here. And this is like diagram between like I think for us it's the same, but it's like on a lot of different like wires. It's like the wire can be from us to the finance ministry. The wire can be from so the material itself gets also like distributed in the real world quite like widely, and the artifacts are happening everywhere, which I think is like one of the beautiful sort of reasons why this project like I think spreads so good, because it like works in like all of these different medias.
Yeah, I think at least the way that I think about artists building worlds is there's usually a connection between the digital and the physical, and they're bringing those two worlds together within a project. And sometimes there's maybe like increasingly an AI component to it as well. But yeah, I'm really interested in how artists are thinking about complex rules. And yeah, you're certainly right about that that very long history of systems in art, and what some people would also maybe call generative arts. So I did this timeline that I argue goes back 70,000 years. Philip Galanter also makes that argument. There are these art historical traditions of instructions in art that go back to, of course, like Solowid and Fluxus, and lots of people have talked about that genealogy with software. And basically what has changed with systems is just the technologies and how we can creatively implement them, and software has allowed for a lot of different and interesting things.
I think also like quickly like referring to like protocol art, I'm always excited when like these like something like this comes up, just like because we've been like in this kind of awkward situation that everybody always wants to like categorize like artworks or like artistic positions. And we were always like, kind of like, it's always like a little bit of an awkward situation where you refer to like all of like these different traditions, but you never really feel 100% like included in them. And so we were always sitting in between chairs quite a bit. So high hopes for protocol art.
You're definitely right. But it's still being, I think it's still being written by people like Holly and Matt, and by people like Primavera, and so there's still, it's still being sorted out. But I think your practice definitely comes up when I think about it, and especially in terms of like smart contract art and how to utilize smart contracts within art. Like the way I sort of think about worlds is they have richness, like they have detail. They also have autonomy, and I think your projects clearly have that like agentic autonomy. And then there's also they have like, they're alive, or they're living, like they can reproduce, or they produce something themselves, or they keep living beyond the artist's intent. And like that's kind of one of the ways that I'm thinking about them. I am interested in sort of other links to art history, so like especially links to traditions like land art. How do you see this work borrowing from those lineages, and is there anything else? Like I think social sculpture is something you've maybe talked about before, but is there anything you want to talk about in terms of some of the like the other art historical lineages of this work?
I think, I mean, it's also hard to like, because it was quite a diverse tradition, I would say. And, but I think like we had like a critique of like, maybe like the poster works of land art, where we felt like, okay, it's kind of interesting, but then it kind of like falls back into using the land as like a pure materiality to like shape something out of it. And of course there was something which was also like maybe like overlapping more with like concept art, etc., which had more depth to it. But we felt always like often like these like well-discussed projects often neglect actually like the complexity of, for example, the ecosystem on site, or like the law relation built on top of it, or like the social or historic context of like these pieces. I mean, like if you, for example, like think of like Spiral Jetty, people were always like coming up with like Agnes Dennis, like the Tree Mountain, for example, which is I think quite an interesting work at that time and still is, but also shows maybe, I need to be careful here, but maybe like a little bit of like the pitfalls, because because it kind of like really enforces like a shape, like literally like a geometric shape on something, like so on a living ecosystem. And if you look at it, I mean, like it always looked better on like a like on like these beautiful drawings on like in the phase of conceptualization, rather than like after a couple of decades where the forest really struggles, because like these trees are not meant to like planted in like geometric shapes, and they're like prone to like being tipped over by wind and like like getting diseases.
There are really interesting like YouTube videos of this, where people fly with drones through it and take a look how it looks now, and it's quite, there's something, or there's some truth to it, in the sense that it's really forcing a certain sort of methodology of nature onto this thing, or forcing certain like ideas of nature onto something living, and the non-intended consequences of this are for us really interesting, actually.
Yeah. And I think for us, like the most interesting, or like for me, I don't know, but like the most interesting materiality of our projects is always like really just like the core of it is really like the change in ownership. And it's like something really intangible, but then like which has like really complex and long lasting tangible results, like maybe like because the ecosystem changed, or like maybe because people can now, as it's the case with autonomous forests, suddenly have a way to like participate in like a process they couldn't be like participating before, and like shaping it maybe in the way that suddenly like social groups share around it, like people meet, become friends, I don't know. And I think this aspect of it is really like really interesting for us. And I think Paul touched on this earlier, that it is also like this moment of like, like we sit down for like nearly 4 years and draft like this project and implement this, and then like the result is something we explicitly designed to be taken out of our hands, like as in how it's going to develop in the next years, and what direction it will steer, what people it will attract, like really giving up also your own artistic agency over like what's previously conceived as an artwork. I think like this is really interesting, or has like a kind of interesting tension, which also has like a lot of like conflicting implications, of course. But I think this is also nice to endure and to see what really comes out of it as like a process which you can't control.
Yeah, well, I think that's just how creation is going to evolve, and how it has evolved, and that it's not creating, artists are no longer at least limited to creating finite objects. They have these different possibilities to explore, and they can use all these new technologies and new ideas to implement them in these exciting and interesting ways. And I think your project is such a perfect example of that direction in art, and that's the main reason why I wanted to chat today. And yeah, but I guess before we completely end, is there anything else you wanted to say as we wrap up?
I mean, I would maybe just add to what Paul just was describing, a theoretical reference. So if you would look into like philosophy for this more interconnected view of this like different sphere. I think like Felix Guattari's three ecologies is sort of a great way of looking at it, in which he tries to sort of connect basically a sort of economic mode of production towards regenerative and ecological mode of production towards like something which is a mental mode of production, and how these things sort of like interwire and sort of interfere. And I do think like looking specifically at earlier land art, we can see how only certain specific aspects of these three modes were thought through, but not all of them together. And I think our project is more trying to think through all of these different stacks of sort of reproduction, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really excited for where it all heads, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on it. And it was really good to see the, like, what was this week with the NFT launch on, was it Monday the 15th?
Yeah.
Was that, yeah, like, how did it feel after so many years to, I mean, yeah, like, what did this step sort of feel like for you guys? Did it feel like the end in a way? Because, I mean, but obviously it's not, but it was but you are in the process of sort of giving up control, and yeah, so like how did this step feel in the sort of overall evolution of the project, maybe as the very last thing?
Well, I think there like were already like multiple steps where we gave up. I mean, like, there's like the general meeting. We kind of formed the association, and like basically once we registered this association with, at the beginning it was like 19 members and then like a board of 6. This was like the moment where we legally gave up like a lot of our agency in this project. And then now on Monday, the sale opened of the first batch of NFTs, which, like, I also want to stress, we are like a registered non-profit organization. All profits go directly to the association, doesn't get to anywhere else. And all profits are then meant, we have already acquired 2 plots of forest, and now the new profits are meant to acquire the 3rd one. It kind of is like a gradual step, so it didn't felt so intense, and it does not at all feel like an end, because we both know, I think, like how much longer this project will keep us on the toes, and maybe then not as the role of the artist behind it, but rather as, for now, like our shared membership of being on the board. But then also I think it's really the next months, years will really be about like building up like a sound community around it, which is like able to steer the project further. So I think there's still a lot of things to do. And then also, like, I think this is now like the exciting time, you know, like the last 4 years were kind of a little bit tedious sometimes, where we were for 1 year only fighting with the tax office in Germany, trying to convince them that we are non-profit worthy and not a crypto scam. You know, like, this is the time we're happy, which is over, but like we're excited for whatever comes next, also because we really can't tell.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I'm just excited to see where these experiments with ownership and blockchains and, yeah, different stacks of protocols, how it all plays out. And it's definitely something that I want to keep an eye on. And I've just been impressed by the community's response to the project so far, and the people that are interested are, yeah, the people that I think we should be paying attention to. So yeah, it's a really exciting project, and really happy that we got to talk about it today and that you took the time to chat. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And
thank you. It was great.
That was very nice.
I liked it. Cool.
All right, take care, guys.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.